The night over the Lincolnshire Fens in the autumn of 1941 was a different kind of battlefield, one defined not by the heroic, swirling dogfights of the recent Battle of Britain, but by a profound and terrifying vulnerability. The systemic failure was not a minor glitch. It was a yawning chasm in the entire defensive architecture of the island, and it was felt most acutely by the men on the ground who could do nothing but look up. Sergeant Thomas Haggard, a career mechanic with hands permanently etched in carbon and engine oil, was one of those men. His world was one of precise tolerances, of cause and effect, of inputs and outputs. An engine misfires because a fuel line is blocked. A landing gear fails to lower because a hydraulic seal has blown. For every fault, there is a logical, traceable cause and a methodical procedure for repair. The war, from his perspective in the maintenance hangars of a secondary airfield, was a series of colossal, repetitive mechanical failures. And the greatest of these failures was the night. The system, as it stood, was elegant in theory but tragically brittle in practice. By day, it was an integrated, technologically advanced machine. Radar chains on the coast provided the input, plotting the raiders' approach. This data was filtered through the filter rooms, transmitted to sector stations, and output as coordinated vectors to waiting squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes. It was a system of interception, of meeting the threat at distance and neutralizing it, but night stripped every advantage away. The radar was primitive, the fighters blind, the system's elegant circuitry shorted out in the darkness. What remained was a reversion to a cruder, First World War model, a barrier defense, anti-aircraft guns, great barking howitzers, flung shells into the black in hopeful, unaimed barrages. Their purpose was less about direct destruction and more about disruption, to force bombers higher, to spoil their aim, to fray their nerves. Searchlights, operated by dedicated crews, swept the clouds, trying to cone a raider, to pin it in their luminous grasp. But even if they succeeded, the victory was fleeting and often futile. A bomber caught in the intersecting beams was a spectacular, silver insect, but it was a target for which there was no adequate weapon. A rifle, a Lewis gun, it was a gesture, not a solution. The window of engagement, those 10 or 15 seconds as the plane traversed the illuminated cone, was agonizingly brief. The probability of a hit with small arms fire was a statistical phantom. Haggard watched this failure night after night. He wasn't a strategic thinker in the war room sense. He was a diagnostician. He observed the process from his unique vantage point, the receiving end. He saw the input, the ominous drone of Heinkel and Dornier engines growing from a hum to a thunder. He saw the process, the frantic searchlights, the booming ack-ack firing at sound rather than sight, the occasional, almost accidental, success. And he saw the output, the crump of bombs on the perimeter, the bloom of fire from a hit fuel truck, the shuddering impact on a hangar. The system's output was destruction on our asterisk side. The feedback loop was catastrophic. Flaw was glaringly obvious to his engineer's mind, a catastrophic disconnect between target acquisition and target destruction. The searchlights could find, but nothing could kill in the time allotted. This is where the common perception of heroism diverges from Haggard's reality. The instinctive, romantic response to such a failure might be to demand better tools from higher command, to plead for faster night fighters, more accurate predictors for the guns. But Haggard's mentality was not that of a petitioner. It was that of a mechanic on a desperate, permanent shift. When a vital part fails and there's no spare, you don't write a letter to the manufacturer. You go to the scrap pile, you find something that can be adapted, and you make it work. You asterisk jury, rig asterisk, the system had failed, so he would design a new subsystem to bolt onto the broken machine. His design thinking was rooted entirely in the principles of mechanical engineering and probability. He broke down the problem into its constituent parts. First, the target, a large, relatively slow-moving aircraft in a predictable beam of light. Second, the engagement window, approximately 10-15 seconds. Third, the desired outcome, not a disabling hit, but catastrophic destruction. A bomber is a pressure vessel filled with fuel, bombs, and men. A handful of rifle rounds in its fuselage would not guarantee a kill. You needed to saturate it, to overwhelm its structural integrity in one violent pass. The solution, therefore, had to be about volume and density. Volume of fire and density of impact within the critical time frame. A single barrel, even a rapid, firing Vickers, could not deliver the required payload fast enough. The answer lay in multiplication and simultaneity. He needed a weapon that didn't fire in a stream, but in a asterisk storm asterisk. The concept of the Gatling gun, multiple barrels rotated by an external force to prevent overheating and allow for a sustained, incredible rate of fire, was not new. It was, in fact, obsolescent. But its principle was sound, and crucially, it was a mechanical principle, not an electrical or chemical one. Haggard understood gears, cranks, and bearings. He did not understand advanced primer ignition or recoil-operated mechanisms. He would build a system he could comprehend, maintain, and fix with a wrench and a file. Thus began the translation of a systemic solution into physical form. The 6 barrels scavenged from the junk pile of battle, damaged hurricanes, were not chosen by accident. 6 was a number of balance and practicality. They provided the multiplicative factor he needed. The 303 round was the standardized input. His machine would simply deliver more of them, faster. The central rotor, machined from the differential of a scrapped Albion lorry, was a masterpiece of adaptive thinking. A differential's purpose is to translate power from the engine to the wheels while allowing them to rotate at different speeds. A complex, robust system of gears designed for smooth, continuous operation under immense torque. To Haggard, it was a ready-made, pre-hardened rotary mechanism. He didn't need to invent a rotor. He needed to repurpose one. The feed system was the next critical subsystem. A standard belt-fed mechanism would jam under the torrential rate of fire he envisioned. His solution was a gravity-assisted drum-fed design using the 40-gallon fuel tank. It was bulky, inelegant, but it held a colossal amount of ammunition, nearly 1,000 rounds. This meant sustained fire without a reload during a critical engagement. The bicycle chain linking the crank to the rotation mechanism was the epitome of simple, reliable force transmission. Every part spoke of availability and function. There was no superfluity, but the true brilliance of his systemic thinking extended beyond the weapon itself. He integrated his new subsystem into the existing, faltering larger system. He didn't set up his gun in a random field. He studied the approach lanes, the patterns of the searchlight crews. He positioned his emplacement at a point where bombers, once coned, would naturally track as they tried to escape the beams or line up for a bombing run. He coordinated informally with the searchlight battery commander. There was no radio link, no integrated command. It was a nod, a shared understanding born of shared frustration. Asterisk, you light them, asterisk, the arrangement went, asterisk, and I'll hit them. Asterisk, he was plugging his lethal new module directly into the only functional part of the night defense network, the human eyes and the electric lights. The night of the test arrived. It was not a formal trial, it was another raid. The system failure manifested as usual. The drone, the searchlights probing, the ACAC firing blind. Then, a beam pinned a Heinkel 111. It hung there, glittering. This was the input. For the anti-aircraft guns, it was too close, too fast. For the riflemen, it was a distant, impossible shot. Haggard became the processor. He traversed the heavy gun, not with a soldier's instinct, but with a fitter's precision, like aligning a propeller shaft. He estimated lead, not by instinct, but by a subconscious calculation of traverse speed and projectile velocity. Then he applied the power, the crank. The weapon roared to life, not with the staccato of a machine gun, but with a continuous, ripping, tearing sound that witnesses said was like nothing they had ever heard. The sound of the systemic failure itself being violently dismantled. The output was instantaneous and devastating. A solid, almost liquid-looking rope of tracer, the visible manifestation of his calculated volume, reached up and enveloped the starboard wing, root of the Heinkel. The effect was not of bullets piercing, but of mechanical dissolution. The wing separated. The bomber cartwheeled from the light into darkness, ending in a fireball. The feedback loop had been irrevocably altered. The input lit bomber now led to a new, reliable output destroyed bomber. What followed in those 14 minutes was the relentless, iterative proof of his systemic redesign. It was a brutal, real-time validation. Searchlight crews, electrified by the success, worked with renewed fervor, steering beams to give him the best shot. He engaged not as a heroic individual, but as the central, firing component of an ad hoc, but suddenly efficient network. A Junkers 88, seeing the fate of the first raider, banked violently, but into the path of his sustained fire. A Dornier, trying to jettison its bombs and climb, presented its entire length to the stream of rounds. Each engagement was a solved equation. Each flaming wreckage on the Lincolnshire landscape was a data point confirming the hypothesis. The failure was not in the concept of night defense, but in the caliber of response. He had closed the loop. He had provided the missing kinetic link between detection and annihilation. In the smoky dawn, as the all clear sounded, the evidence was irrefutable. 7 bombers, 14 minutes. The system asterisk his asterisk system had operated with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. He didn't whoop or cheer. He examined the gun. The barrels were warped from heat. The feed mechanism was fouled. The bicycle chain was stretched. He saw not a triumph, but a piece of machinery that had performed under extreme stress and now required servicing. The systemic failure of the night had been patched temporarily by a subsystem built from scrap and logic. And as any good mechanic knows, the work of maintenance is never done. The flaw in the larger machine remained, but for one night in one sector a man had redesigned the circuit, and the sky, for a brief, furious interval, had been made whole again. The legend of the RAF scrap, metal Gatling gun, often gets framed as a stroke of brilliant invention, a flash of individual genius that somehow leapt decades of weapons development. This is a misunderstanding, and it does a disservice to the true, gritty nature of the achievement. The sergeant's triumph was not one of invention, of conjuring something from the ether of pure thought, but of radical, practical adaptation. It was the highest expression of a mindset forged in the workshops and hangars of the RAF, the absolute, uncompromising faith in the potential of what already exists. His genius lay not in creating new tools, but in seeing the dormant, lethal purpose in objects that had been declared dead, obsolete, or useless. He was a master of context, able to divorce an object from its intended function and reimagine its essence within a new, desperate equation. To understand this, you must first understand the landscape of his world, the maintenance hangar and its attendant scrap yard. This was not a sterile laboratory. It was a mechanical boneyard, a cathedral of the broken and the spent. Here the detritus of the air war accumulated. Fighters that had limped home with cylinders shot out, wings sheared by cannon fire, undercarriages collapsed in hard landings. There were crates of parts, some serviceable, some not. There were the skeletons of lorries that had given their all on the perimeter track. There were piles of discarded linkages, bent control cables, cracked manifolds, and the omnipresent, oily smell of failure and effort. To the untrained eye, it was junk. To the sergeant, it was the most well-stocked library in the world. Every item was a noun with a verb waiting to be applied. A shattered propeller wasn't a tragedy. It was a source of high-grade, stressed aluminium alloy. A seized engine block wasn't a paperweight. It was a mass of precision, cast iron. His mind was a continuous, subconscious catalog, a mental inventory of tensile strengths, material properties, and geometric possibilities. This is the critical foundation. He did not set out to invent a Gatling gun. The concept of the multi-barrel rotary gun existed. It was a known, if antiquated, mechanical principle. His starting point was the problem, the need for overwhelming volume of fire. The solution pathway then became not design from first principles, but what do I have that can be made to do that? This is a fundamentally different cognitive process. It is engineering by constraint, innovation within a cage of severe limitations. There were no blueprints from the armaments design department, no deliveries of specialized steel, no wind tunnel testing. There was only the scrap pile, a lathe, a welding torch, and a profound understanding of how things work. Take the very heart of the weapon, the rotating barrel assembly. Inventing a reliable, high-speed rotor from scratch under a shed with hand tools was a near impossible task. But adapting one that was feasible. His gaze fell upon the heavy, complex differential unit of a Bedford or Albion lorry, lying in the scrap pile like a mechanized skull. In its previous life, its function was to allow drive wheels to rotate at different speeds while turning a corner. A masterpiece of practical mechanical negotiation. To the sergeant, its purpose was irrelevant. What he saw was its essence, a robust, sealed housing containing a planetary gear system already designed to translate input torque into smooth, rotary motion. The gears were hardened steel, precisely cut, mounted on bearings and enclosed against dirt. It was, in effect, a pre-made, incredibly sturdy rotary base. He didn't need to understand vehicular dynamics. He needed to understand that this lump of metal could be made to spin in a controlled, powerful way. The act of machining its casing to accept the barrels wasn't invention. It was modification. It was taking a solved problem, how to create smooth rotation under load, and reapplying that solution to a new problem, how to spin 6 gun barrels. The barrels themselves are the purest example of adaptive logic. Standard, issue 303 Browning machine gun barrels were not designed for a Gatling configuration. They were designed to be fixed, to heat up, to be cooled by air, and to be quickly swapped by an armorer. But they were available. They were the standardized ammunition delivery system of the RAF. His reasoning was brutally pragmatic. The round, the 303, is the constant. The weapon is merely the delivery mechanism. Therefore, any delivery mechanism that can reliably chamber and fire the 303 is valid. The fact that these barrels were spent, or from damaged guns, was almost an advantage. They were already written off the books. He was liberating them from their bureaucratic fate. By clustering them, he wasn't inventing a new barrel. He was multiplying an existing one, and in doing so, he solved the very problem that plagued fixed machine guns, overheating. The rotary principle allowed each barrel to fire, then spend time cooling as it cycled around. A built-in redundancy he inherited from the Gatling concept, but implemented with utterly standardized. Disposable parts, then the feed mechanism. A machine gun's feed is its most delicate dance. A stumble means a jam, and a jam in a moment of crisis is death. Designing a reliable feed for a home, made high rate of fire weapon is a nightmare. His solution was a masterpiece of adaptive good enough engineering. The modified 40-gallon auxiliary fuel tank. Consider its original purpose: to hold volatile aviation fuel under pressure, to be light, strong, and sealed. Now consider its new purpose: to hold a coiled belt of 303 cartridges, to feed them by gravity and spring tension into a violent mechanism. The adaptation is poetic. The tank already had a sturdy neck and a cap. It was already a pressure vessel, now containing the pressure of a coiled spring, not petrol. It was already designed to be mounted to an aircraft. He didn't invent a drum magazine. He saw a drum that already existed and repurposed its inherent containment property. The feed lips and guide rails he fashioned from sheet steel were crude, but they worked because the gravity, feed from the large tank above, provided a consistent pushing force. It was inelegant, over-engineered for its new task, and therefore supremely reliable. He traded the elegance of a custom-designed magazine for the brutal, adaptive certainty of a system that couldn't help but feed rounds downward. Even the power source was adaptive. An electric motor was a fantasy, a hydraulic system absurd. The power had to be human, direct, and mechanically simple. The bicycle chain, in its peaceful life, it translated the modest, rotary power of a human leg into the motion of a wheel. It was designed for continuous, repetitive stress. By linking it from a hand crank to the central rotor, the X-lorry differential, he was using it for its exact intended purpose, to translate human, powered rotation. He was just changing the context from moving a person down a country lane to moving a storm of lead into the sky. The crank itself might have been from a piece of ground equipment, a starter handle, or even fashioned from a lever. It didn't matter. It was an interface, a simple machine to multiply force. This radical adaptation extended beyond mere components to the very philosophy of the weapon's operation. He did not have a team of loaders, a fire director, or a ballistic computer. He had himself, and perhaps one terrified assistant. So he adapted the gun's asterisk roll asterisk within the tactical system. He couldn't engage in area denial like the heavy anti-aircraft guns. He couldn't hunt like a night fighter. So, he adapted the concept of the ambush. He positioned his weapon not as a mobile piece, but as a fixed battery, like a naval gun emplacement or a sniper's nest. He studied the patterns where the searchlights most often coned their targets, the typical escape routes bombers took when caught in the light. He sighted his gun not for wide coverage, but for a killing zone, a funnel of sky where a lit bomber's path was most predictable. He was adapting the hunter's weight, using the enemy's own evasive procedures against them. The act of firing itself was an adaptation of skill. He was not a trained gunner. He was a fitter, so he did not aim in the classic sense. He laid the gun, as one would lay a tool against a workpiece. The traversing mechanism was likely crude, perhaps just the swivel of the tripod. He would have used the glow of the red-hot barrels, the stream of tracer every fifth round, not as a sight in the telescopic sense, but as a physical reference line, like a plumb bob or a chalk line. He was correcting fire, not by calculation, but by mechanical adjustment, watching where the stream went and cranking the traverse to walk it onto the target. It was gunnery stripped to its bare, adaptive essentials. Point the noisy end at the thing you want to destroy, and keep it there. When the weapon roared to life that night, it was not the birth of an invention. It was the culmination of 1,000 small acts of radical adaptation. Every asterisk clank asterisk of the bicycle chain, every rotation of the lorry, differential heart, every round fed from the bombed-out fuel tank, was a testament to seeing potential where others saw only scrap. The sound it made, that ripping, sustained roar unlike any standard machine gun, was the sound of context being shattered. It was the sound of a lorry's innards screaming in a new language, of bicycle chains singing a song of death, of aircraft fuel tanks finally fulfilling a martial purpose. In the aftermath, as he surveyed the glowing, warped metal of his creation, his thoughts would not have been of patents or revolutionary design. They would have been of maintenance. The barrels needed replacing. Back to the scrap pile for more Browning spares. The chain might need tightening. The feed mechanism needed cleaning. It was a tool assembled from other tools, and it had done a job. The genius was never in making something new under the sun. It was in looking at the sun-bleached, oil-stained debris of a mechanical war and seeing, with absolute clarity, that the pieces to stop that war were already there, waiting for someone to understand not what they were, but what they could be. He didn't invent a weapon. He conducted a symphony of salvage, and for 14 minutes the music was devastating. The concept was a madman's doodle. The construction was a shed-born monstrosity of salvage and sweat. The theory was a mechanic's scrawl on the back of a grease-stained manifest. All of it the sleepless nights at the lathe, the skeptical glances from fellow airmen, the sheer, stubborn defiance of standard issue procedure existed in a realm of pure potential until the moment the system was subjected to the only test that mattered. Not a test on a range, not an inspection by ordnance officers, but the live, unforgiving trial of combat. In the roaring dark over that Lincolnshire airfield, the sergeant's scrap metal Gatling gun ceased to be an idea or an experiment. It became a fact. Its results were not merely successful. They were stark, brutal, and decisively eloquent, writing their verdict across the night sky in lines of tracer and blossoms of flame. The first result was immediate and sensory, the sound. This was the system's opening argument, a statement of intent so violent it rewrote the auditory landscape of the raid. Familiar wartime chorus was the stuttering bark of bolt-action rifles, the slower, deeper asterisk thump, thump, thump asterisk of Lewis guns, the distant, concussive orchestra of the heavy anti-aircraft. Batteries firing blind into the murk. The Gatling gun's voice was none of these. Witnesses described it as a ripping, tearing noise, a sustained, metallic roar like a giant sheet of canvas being shredded by an angry god. It was a sound of continuous mechanical fury, devoid of the punctuation of a reload or the pause of a barrel change. This sonic signature was the first result. It announced the presence of a new, unknown variable on the battlefield. For the German bomber crews, nestled in their plexiglass and steel cocoons, the familiar threats had a known rhythm. This sound was alien, relentless, and it came from below, from the very ground they thought was passive and prey. The psychological result preceded the physical one, a spike of unknown fear. Then came the geometry of destruction, the visible proof of the system's output. A searchlight beam, wavering and then firm, would imprison a Heinkel 111. For those watching from the ground, this was a familiar, frustrating spectacle, the quarry illuminated but out of reach. Now the sergeant would traverse his heavy instrument. The stream of fire that leapt upward was not a line of individual tracers, but a solid, molten-looking rope. It was density made visible. The 303 round, insignificant on its own, became a relentless, collective entity. The result of this focused volume was not the puncturing of an aircraft, but its mechanical disassembly. The first bomber to die by the gun did not simply crash, it came apart. The stream walking onto the starboard wing, root the complex junction of wing and fuselage, a nexus of spars, fuel lines, and control cables did not just punch holes. It acted as a furious, high-speed saw, metal skin peeled back like paper, structural members designed to withstand immense aerodynamic forces were severed in a heartbeat. The wing in a single grotesque motion, folded upward and then tore clean away. The aircraft did not enter a spin. It performed a catastrophic, cartwheeling disintegration, its remaining structure succumbing to forces it was never meant to withstand. The fireball that followed was almost an afterthought. This was the stark result, the translation of theoretical volume of fire into the tangible reality of asterisk structural overload asterisk. The system did not outshoot the bomber, it outstressed its airframe. The second result was demonstrative of the system's shocking efficiency, its brutal economy of motion. A Junkers 88, pilot alerted by the fate of the first raider or the strange, roaring sound from below, initiated a violent evasive bank. In the calculus of standard anti-aircraft fire, this would have saved it. The predicted aim point of the heavy guns would now be empty sky. But the sergeant's system was not aiming a single shell. He was managing a hose, As the junkers turned, he simply kept the crank turning and tracked the target, the stream of fire now painting a curving arc across the blackness. The bomber, in its desperate turn, flew into the ongoing torrent. The result here was not a clean disassembly, but a saturation. Rounds walked from tail to cockpit, shattering the rear gun position, chewing through the fuselage, and finally silencing the cockpit. The aircraft dead in the air, its crew and systems obliterated, continued its turn into a shallow, ghostly descent until it met the earth. The system had demonstrated its adaptability. It could engage a moving target not by complex prediction, but by simple, sustained application. The result was a dead bomber killed by its own evasion. The third result was one of multiplicative terror, a psychological cascading failure induced in the enemy formation. The raid was not a single entity but a loose swarm, each crew focused on their bomb, run, their navigation, their survival. The sudden, violent disappearance of one aircraft was noted. The second, dying in a new and terrifying way, registered as an urgent threat. By the time the third was coned in the searchlights, a Dornier 17, slim and fast, the unseen ground, base terror had a name in the minds of every radio operator hearing the confused, panicked calls. The Dornier's pilot, likely seeing the lethal river of light reach for him, jettisoned his bomb load in a wild attempt to climb away. This was a result in itself. The mission abort, the weapon wasted harmlessly in a field, but in climbing, he presented the broad, underside profile of his aircraft to the gun. The result was apocalyptic. The stream of fire raked from nose to tail, igniting fuel lines, detonating ammunition in the dorsal gun, turning the aircraft into a flying funeral pyre that hung for a moment, a second sun, before plunging down. This third kill cemented the system's reputation. It was now a hunter, and its territory was the cone of the searchlights. The result was a localized air supremacy, established from a toolshed. The fourth and fifth kills were testament to the system's endurance and the sergeant's icy composure as its operator. The weapon was not a magical, endless source of fury. The barrels, glowing cherry red, were beginning to warp. The adapted lorry differential at its heart was screaming in protest, hot oil smelling. The bicycle chain was stretched taut. Yet the system held. Another Heinkel, trying to skirt the deadly zone, was caught on the fringe of a beam. The sergeant, now working with a rhythm that fused man and machine, crank, traverse, observe, adjust, sent a burst that shattered the port side engines. The aircraft, unbalanced and losing power, slid from the light into darkness, its death confirmed moments later by a distant, ground-shaking explosion. Then, almost immediately, a second Heinkel, blinded perhaps by the flash of its comrade's end, flew straight and level through the killing zone. The result was almost clinical. The stream centered on the cockpit glass, which vanished in a glittering cloud, and the bomber flew on, a ghost ship, until it nosed into the farmland. The sixth result was one of sheer, defiant willpower. The physical system was at its breaking point. The sergeant's arm was a column of agonized fire, his body battered by the weapon's vibration, his ears deadened by its roar. His assistant, feeding the ammunition, was burned by hot brass and choking on cordite. The searchlight crews were exhausted, their beams trembling. Yet the system, this ad hoc network of light, nerve, and scrap metal, persisted. A bomber, perhaps believing the fury had ceased, ventured back. The beam found it. With a final, Herculean effort, the crank was turned. The roar was ragged now, strained. But the stream, still dense, still lethal, found its mark on the bomber's tail assembly, shredding its control surfaces. The result was a loss of stability, a slow, spiraling descent that ended not in a fireball, but in a crumpled, silent heap of metal. A different kind of death, but just as final. The seventh kill was the period on the sentence. It was likely a straggler, damaged perhaps by other fire, or simply lost. It wandered into the illuminated arena. By this point, The system was running on the dregs of its mechanical and human energy. The burst that brought the 7th bomber down was shorter, a savage final cough of defiance. The aircraft simply seemed to stumble in the air, an engine detaching, and it fell away. Then silence. The sudden absence of the ripping roar was as shocking as its introduction. The all-clear siren sounded, its wail pathetic against the memory of the gun's voice. The results lay scattered across miles of countryside. 7 distinct pyres or crumples of wreckage, some blazing, some smoldering. Over 100 German airmen, a significant fraction of a raid's strength, had been deleted from the war in less than a quarter of an hour by a weapon that did not officially exist, operated by a man who was not a combatant. This was the decisive strategic result. It was a tactical victory of stunning proportion, but more importantly, it was an intelligence enigma and a morale earthquake. For the Luftwaffe, it introduced a terrifying, unexplained hazard into the night, bombing landscape, a zone of absolute lethality that defied their understanding of British ground defenses. For the RAF personnel on the field, it was a transformative moment of empowerment. The helplessness of the night had been answered. The ground had bitten back, and with unimaginable ferocity. But the final, most profound result was not in the sky or on the enemy's morale charts. It was in the proof of concept. Before that night, the system was a theory, a garage tinkerer's dream. Afterward, it was a combat, proven fact. The results were the data. They proved that radical adaptation could bridge the gap between detection and destruction. They proved that ingenuity could be a direct, measurable combat multiplier. They proved that in a war of industrial production, the most devastating weapon on a given night could be assembled not from a factory line, but from a scrap pile, guided by a mind that understood function over form. In the cold light of dawn, the sergeant would have surveyed his tool. The elegant, interconnected adaptation of lorry parts, bicycle chains, and aircraft junk was now a burnt-out, strained, and warped relic. The results were etched not only in the smoldering fields beyond the perimeter fence, but in the glowing metal, the stretched chain, the blackened barrels. The system had passed its ultimate test. It had delivered stark, brutal, and decisive results, and in doing so it ceased to be a mere contraption. It became a legend, written not in patent filings, but in fire, in shattered aluminum, and in the sudden, respectful silence of the night that followed.